Welcome to History Forum. I'm your host, Dr. Jacob Roram. In this program, we're featuring Stephen Kantrowitz, author of Citizens of a Stolen Land, a Ho-Chunk History of 19th-Century United States, and Josie Lee, director of the Ho-Chunk Nation Museum and Cultural Center, for a conversation on Ho-Chunk history, land, and contemporary life, offering fresh perspectives on the past and its ongoing impact. We are glad to welcome them to History Forum. For over 20 years, History Forum has brought the best U.S. history scholars to St. Paul to share award-winning books and cutting-edge historical research. Each talk may illuminate a history you've never heard before or bring a new perspective on a familiar topic. But regardless, each program will give you a deeper and more complex understanding of the past and your relationship to it. Enjoy the program.
Good morning, or we're still in morning, okay. Hani chawida hepi, hungshi najiga hingaide, chai akichka wan angshana, honi khonaikeja hachiajed. My name is Josie Lee. I am a member of the Ho-Chunk Nation, as Jacob said. I live in Toma, and I'm part of the Deer Clan. And so I'm going to start us off just a little bit today to talk first about Stephen's book, and then we're going to go into how books like his and Kathy's also help us talk about Ho-Chunk history. So for my job, most days I get a run of questions from things like, do you have a language? Which, yes, just showed you. Also questions like, do you live in a teepee? It's surprising, but people do ask those questions. And then there are more deeper prodding questions, which I don't always have the answers to, but thankfully others do. So one of those questions that I get quite a bit is, how are Ho-Chunks still in Wisconsin? And it's a really challenging question to answer. So I'm going to ask Dr. Kantrowitz to answer that question so I don't have to. No.
And I'm going to tell you, just read the book. Let's go.
No, so one of the questions that gets asked quite a bit is there a Ho-Chunk history available in book format, and where can I get it? To which there wasn't actually anything written until very recently. And with that, I'm going to ask Dr. Kantrowitz how he started his book.
Okay. Well, first, thanks for being here, Josie, and thanks for doing this with me. And thanks, Jacob and the History Center for inviting us, and this just great to see you. Thank you for coming out today. So how did how did a nice kid like me end up in a place like this, right? Here, just so happens. Yeah, so I moved to Madison, Wisconsin in 1995, and I was hired to be the Civil War guy at the University of Wisconsin, and so I was. And I did books on the politics of white supremacy in the 19th century South, and on struggles for African-American citizenship in the 19th century North. But I was sitting on my back patio about 15 years ago now with our then colleague Ned Blackhawk and a few other scholars. And Ned just sort of mentioned offhand, well, this whole neighborhood's built on effigy mounds. And I didn't get it exactly, but sure enough, it turned out right in front of our front door was the head of a 200-foot goose mound that had been there until 100 years ago when the neighborhood was built. And the whole neighborhood literally was on top of the effigy landscape, the burial mound landscape of southern Wisconsin, which is the most intense area of mound building in North America. And that set me going, because when you're trained as a U.S. historian, and I say U.S. historian, or when you were trained in the late 20th century, unless you were working in early America or you were very lucky in your choice of advisors or programs, you could have little or no Native American history as part of a United States history curriculum. That has changed a little bit in many places now, and a lot in some. But it was really not just a deficit, but a yawning silence. And once I started to pull at that thread and realized that what in my head and in so many other people's heads was prehistory, that weird fiction that somehow you draw a line and say, history started at a given time and everything before that was flat, static, not historical. Oh, that's how we talk about Native people. Prehistoric, not people with history, not people whose history might exist into the present. Oh, and it's been a kind of exercise in first surprise and then shame and then self-education and then engagement to sort of figure out how to undo that work of erasure, I guess, is what we have to call it. And that led me to the question of, well, who built these burial mounds? And what happened to them? And very quickly that led me to the story of the Ho-Chunk people. This is a map that the Department of Cultural Heritage produced that includes both in green the Ho-Chunk people's treaty lands as recognized by the United States in the Treaty of Prairie du Chien in 1825, but also the footprint on which Ho-Chunk people lived and traveled and farmed and made their lives over a much larger area over a very long period of time. That was really, that's continued to be a kind of revelation to me, to remember that the landscape that I think of as Wisconsin and the landscape I think of as the landscape of US history is all, of a couple hundred years old, is also a landscape of a history that is a continuing story that is more than 10,000 years old. And that's been the big awakening of this project and why I have not been able to let it go and why I ended up, despite my better judgment, writing a book about it. And this part of the story that I felt compelled to tell and felt professionally qualified to tell was the story of what we call the removal era. Josie and I have talked about removal. We have sometimes called removal the R word. Because, as the historian Claudio Sant points out, when we say removal, we're using a word that 19th century people used when they were going on vacation. And that, in fact, better terms for removal might be dispossession, exile, banishment, ethnic cleansing, etc. So keep in mind that whenever I slip into that language, that's what's right below the surface of it. And this story on this map is the story in rough outline of the forced migrations of the Ho-Chunk people between the 1820s and the 1870s. And I love this particular map. I love this was produced by a wonderful geographer named Zoltan Grossman based on the work of anthropologist Nancy Lurie. And it's got a lot of important information on it. It's a lot to take in all at once. And I won't try to run you through all of the specifics here. One of the stories in here, the story, I think I was told that there's a pointer on here. Yes. The story of the expulsion of the Ho-Chunk from this reservation to this one is the story that Kathy Coates tells in her book, To Banish Forever. I've tried to sort of cover a lot of ground in this book in a fairly small number of pages to tell the story of how the Ho-Chunk people endured and survived and resisted this cataclysmic series of events pressed upon them by squatters and soldiers and the United States government and its settlers. The story has its origins in the United States' desire for not just to take the Ho-Chunk homeland, but to transform it into something different. That's what settler colonialism is the transformation, the replacement of a people on their land with another society. And that's what the project of the territory of Wisconsin was in 1836. You can see in the middle a crudely drawn native person sort of about to be forced west across the Mississippi River, but in the rest of the landscape, what's supposed to replace it, the civilization that's supposed to take the place of barbarism, as the Latin translates there. A yeoman farmer with a plow and a team, the institutions of modern government, technology, intensive agriculture. There's a whole series of visions of land ownership and land use and who belongs on the land that is the center of the story of the creation of Wisconsin. And in response to that, in reaction to that, and in refusal to be displaced or to submit to the United States government's plans for them, the book follows really three paths that Ho-Chunk people find in reaction to, in response to, in resistance of the United States government's plans for them. And on the left here is Roaring Thunder, Wakanja Heriga, who represents the part of the Ho-Chunk people who refused to leave the homeland, or if forced from the homeland, immediately returned. And that's as much as about half of the nation that just doesn't leave, despite the best efforts of the federal government and the settlers to push them out, to remove them, to cleanse the territory of their presence. They remain. And so his story and their story is really important to the story of the persistence, the survivance of the Ho-Chunk people in Wisconsin. In the middle, Coming Thunder Winishik, Wakanja Guga, who, though he does resist the removal process, leads and tries to shape that process by being a leader of the Ho-Chunk people who are in exile, who are in the diaspora across the Mississippi. And the book also follows him in trying to delay the march up to the Long Prairie Reservation in central Minnesota, in trying to engineer the return from there to Blue Earth, to the better lands that the Ho-Chunk actually desired in southern Minnesota near Mankato. And then enduring and again trying to resist the horrific forced expulsion from Blue Earth in 1863 to Crow Creek. And then also the escape from Crow Creek to the Nebraska Territory and to where the Winnebago Nation of Nebraska today, Winnebago Tribe of Nebraska today, is another Ho-Chunk people, another sovereign nation as a result of that escape and turmoil. And the third figure, the one dressed in what Americans would call citizen's dress, is John Sincere, who was a man of mixed descent, who spent his career identified with and living among Ho-Chunk people, lived in the exile diaspora, served in the United States military during the Civil War, but never lost sight of his role as a person who would help the Ho-Chunk people survive their exile and banishment. And in the 1870s, was one of the people who pressed the Ho-Chunk's claim for reparations for their expulsion from Minnesota. And in the process of that, managed to persuade the United States government that he and the other Minnesota Ho-Chunk who had been expelled in 1863 should be allowed to stay in Minnesota, to either retain the lands that they'd been promised there or take new lands and become citizens of the United States by a special act of Congress. And in 1870 and 1872, about 160 Ho-Chunk people do go to the courthouse here in St. Paul and swear oaths of naturalization as though they were immigrants and become citizens of the United States. So these are three pathways through this, quote, removal era that Ho-Chunk people are pursuing during this time, and the book tries to weave those all together. The culmination of the story for the Ho-Chunk people who remain in Wisconsin is that in 1873, the federal government sets about to expel them one final time. There's a movement among settlers to say, no more Ho-Chunks in Wisconsin. And some federal appropriations are put together, and troops are sent out in the days after Christmas, 1873, to round up Ho-Chunk people in their winter camps. And they do round up hundreds of people and put them on boxcars in the freezing cold and exile them to Nebraska, and hundreds of people die. It's another horrific experience in this 50-year kind of cycle of ethnic cleansing. Except this removal fails. And it fails because the Ho-Chunk people living in Wisconsin have learned a series of lessons from these three different histories that have unfolded in their world over the past 50 years. And some of the lessons they've learned are, if you own land, they won't remove you. If you dress like a citizen should dress, they might not remove you. And if you resist long enough and hard enough, they might give up. And so in 1873, the Ho-Chunks in Wisconsin send this petition to the federal government to say, we don't want to leave. In fact, we want to become citizens of the United States, take up the habits and customs of civilization. We want to become landowners. They're throwing everything at the wall. Everything at the wall, all the key words, all the key ideas that they think will allow them to remain in Wisconsin as Ho-Chunk people. And this time it works. And it works in part because they managed to send the petition to some members of Congress who have no interest in their fate, except that pointing to Wisconsin Republicans' desire to expel the Ho-Chunk from Wisconsin exposes those same Republicans' hypocrisy in demanding that white Southerners accept equal citizenship for African Americans during the Reconstruction era. And so it's white supremacist Democrat from Ohio who successfully embarrasses the Wisconsin Republicans into a critical concession in the removal legislation of 1873, which is it has to be, quote, voluntary. They're not allowed to use force, which is a ticking time bomb under the whole enterprise. And so when the Ho-Chunk are, in fact, expelled by force, there's protests on the floor of Congress, they're taken to Nebraska, and the Nebraska officials discover they have no authorization to use force to keep them there. And the Ho-Chunk immediately begin returning to Wisconsin, which is where you see on this map these return migrations. Until by 1875 or so, so many have left Nebraska and returned to their homeland in Wisconsin that the federal government gives up, allows them to cash out of the tribal fund and purchase homesteads, and calls them citizens of Wisconsin and of the United States. So it's a triumph over colonial power using the terms and the language of colonial power to do the work of remaining Ho-Chunk people in the homeland. And that story really kind of captured me and has continued to capture me as a really tremendous example of the way that people who appear to be powerless, in fact, can figure out how to use the weapons of the conqueror against them and for their own benefit and to their own purposes without surrendering who they are or even where they are. So that's the story, Josie, as I have told it. And I probably went on too long. I did, but that's okay. We have a little bit of time here. And what I want to ask you about is the relationship between this map, which you've seen me show 1,000,000 times, and this beautiful map that some of you may have seen on the way in. What are we looking at?
So this map was a pandemic project. I was laid off during the pandemic, so I had a little bit of free time. And during that free time, I was asked by the Field Museum of Chicago to help tell the story of Ho-Chunk removals. And my first initial inclination was to say no. Because truthfully, the removal period is the absolute worst period of Ho-Chunk history. We have millennia of history where there is both good and bad and really some incredible things to celebrate as being Ho-Chunk people. And it is incredibly frustrating to only have to talk about the worst possible aspect of who we are as Ho-Chunk people. So I said no. And then I thought about it a little bit more and realized that if we don't tell this story and don't have a way where people can access it, then it will not be shared. But I figured it was better to have it from a Ho-Chunk voice and with Ho-Chunk perspectives in a place that shows it visually, because again, not everybody is going to sit and read a history textbook.
It's outrageous, I want to say, but okay.
Not everybody is a historian. And not everybody is a legal scholar or wants to be able to sit and just look at a book. Sometimes it is easier for people like my children to see a visual representation of what this story looks like. So, let's see here. In this map, we have a beginning. So we have Ho-Chunk with our creation story, and just a small portion because it's not for everybody to know. And then we have a nice, beautiful, kind of faded line, so you can see some boundaries of Ho-Chunk territory, because again, it depends on who you talk to, who you were raised by. Everybody has different perspectives on where their families are from and where their families originated and where they took shelter and where they had the most productive farmland. So going back to the original territory seal, Ho-Chunks were prolific farmers. We had farmland all over the state of Wisconsin, which is why the US government wanted us out. We are also incredible lead miners, which is also a portion of why the US government wanted us out. So all of these things that made us who we are in the past, but also today, were connected deeply to this land. So we have that mostly sprinkled in here. And then I think if we go to the next slide, we start talking about some of those removal stories. And I'm really, really fortunate in the fact that I first was able to ask my Choka about removals, and his only thing that he ever told me about that was, we weren't removed, that's the end of the story. And then I had this really incredible opportunity to work with many elders over the last, well, since I was a teenager, 20 years, of being able to hear different family stories of where they were during removals, how they were able to protect themselves, and how certain ones were either able to come back to Wisconsin or how they stayed. And so all of that carried into how we talked about this map. So within this map, we also included Ho-Chunk names of places because honestly, those are the most important first and foremost. They are our connections to those lands. They are our connections as people to who we are and those stories, as well as the location. Within this map, as you saw, there were lots of arrows that go one direction and then another. Within these stories of removal, there are always the returns. So even though my family wasn't one that was removed, my husband's was. And so we have stories from his family of, we know that the Winisheks went to Long Prairie, but within that, we also see their movement back home. Yeah.
I think there's one more, maybe we have one more blow up from the, oh yeah.
Oh yeah.
Yeah. I love what you did with this and the way that the stories are broken down, so it's almost like a graphic novel in some ways, except that there's a constant dialogue and the voice, the Ho-Chunk voice in it is so clearly yours, right? You're telling the stories as you've heard them and know them and have researched them and have understood them. The last bit that we blew up was we're still abiding by those principles today, and I wonder if you'd say a few words about that piece of the map and the story here.
Yeah, so as everybody in this room hopefully knows, is that we are existing in a treaty territory. And as citizens of the state of Wisconsin and the state of Minnesota, you also have to abide by those treaty principles, which means that as Ho-Chunk Nation citizens, we have rights to our land. We have rights to make use of the land in ways that were agreed within that treaty, as well as guaranteed access to healthcare and education and discussions with the government to make sure that we are able to take care of our people as a government. And so some of those things are negotiated within the treaties, but they're also a thing that we have to include within our politics today. So things that we talk about within our government structure as well as in negotiations with the federal government and the state. So that is what is included here. But more so than that, because I am me, I also included a little bit of a call to action. And so at the time, it was a little bit easier to do with a different political climate, but it's still something that needs to be addressed today. So we do know that we have constitutional rights associated with our treaties that are laid out through those treaty negotiations. And that is what is in here.
What's the reaction or response been to this at the Field Museum?
The biggest thing that we have gotten is where can we get access to this map? So I have a in-person one out in the hallway that you guys hopefully saw when you came in, and please take a look at it on your way back out. And then the Field Museum, their education staff has been working really hard to try to make this map accessible online. But the thing is that it's meant to be experienced in person because it is so much harder physically to go and look at every small detail and move your body alongside of that map. And that's the point, is that removals are uncomfortable. They should be uncomfortable to talk about. Expulsion and genocide should be uncomfortable for people to talk about, but it should also be uncomfortable to sit and be a third-party viewer too.
Let me ask you a question about this it just occurred to me that I haven't really asked you in this way before, so improvisation here, which is this the Ho-Chunk version of what I was trying to do? Or would a Ho-Chunk version of what I was trying to do look very different than this and what I did? Or would there not be a Ho-Chunk version of what I tried to do? I don't know if any of that makes sense.
That's a difficult question.
Yeah.
In part, it is a Ho-Chunk version. Both of my parents are map makers. So this has been ingrained in me for a long time. But yes and no. I think that the Ho-Chunk version of history is always telling stories from the way that we understand it. And it's not necessarily to agree or disagree with written text because everything is always from one perspective in the written text. But we can understand that a map like this comes from one person's perspective or a couple people's perspective of what we understand of our own history, with also the understanding that somebody else may have a different version that they've heard, and they may also have a different understanding of what their family went through.
Yeah, right. When I'm looking at the reels of Record Group 75, letters received by the Indian Agency from the Winnebago Agency from 1838, let's say. And in there, miraculously, is the transcription of what the interpreter said that Roaring Thunder said in protest of the Treaty of 1837. I'm like, wow, because that's as close to a 19th century Ho-Chunk voice as I can get, right? As I can get. And what you just said makes me think, yes, I've got one voice, right?
Right.
One person's angle on a very complicated and violent historical experience, right? So something is better than nothing, of course, but it's only one angle in, right? How is it possible to represent multiple voices at once here? Are you trying to do that? Are you trying to synthesize voices? How are you thinking about that?
So this is the topic of curation.
Yes.
So within this specific map, we had 3 community voices, and it was really helpful because 2 of the voices were our THPOs, so the Tribal Historic Preservation Officer for Ho-Chunk, and then the Tribal Historic Preservation Officer for Nebraska. And obviously, the Ho-Chunk of Wisconsin version of history is going to look different than the one of Nebraska because we had 2 different experiences. Yeah. Some shared, some vastly different. And so within this map, there are 3 voices. The only thing that you might see that sounds kind of similar through all of it is I had to go and edit to make sure that it kind of sounds like a unified voice. But truthfully, even my own stories it's a mixture of all the other people that I've learned from.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it works incredibly well that way.
Yeah.
So when we were getting ready to do this, you found this image in the Minnesota collections, and we decided we wanted to put it up and talk about it a little bit. So this is from the Minnesota Historical Society's collections. And what do you see?
So first off, I was asked to curate a case for the Historical Society for this talk. And as you came in through the entryway, there are 4 pieces within that case. A beautiful beaded bandolier bag, 2 beaded garters or armbands, I can't remember what they're called off the top of my head. And then I also grabbed this photo. So this photo was taken in 1963, I believe. I think is what the card says.
1863.
Oh, I'm sorry, 1863. Oh my goodness. Let me drink more coffee.
It's only because when I say 63, I always mean 1863.
Yeah, goodness. So this photo has no information with it other than a date. It was taken in St. Paul or published by a St. Paul gallery. And because of that, we have no information about who these individuals are. We can see that there are 3 men sitting in the front, not directly looking at the camera. We can see that there are 2 women sitting in the back, away from the men. And typically what photographers did at that time was try to stage something so that it brought intrigue to their subject matters. Within this, we see 2 homes and a cooking area. And then you can actually see, I think it looks like 2 additional homes in the background. Based on the home structure, we can see that they are more semi-permanent structures versus what would have been set up at the prisoner of war camp. But it depends on when the photo was taken. So the questions that I do have specifically about this are these individuals actually held in camp? Was this photo actually published later within the time frame? Was it taken in Nebraska to show that Ho-Chunks were no longer living in Wisconsin, or is there something else to go alongside of it? Yeah. We do know that the Whitney Gallery did try to take some images of Ho-Chunks at the time, I believe, but there's a lot of unknowns.
A lot of question marks about this, right? And it would be great if there are people who have insight into this too here in the room. But the permanence of the structures and the presence of the arbor there suggests it's not the middle of winter, right?
Yes.
And suggests maybe it's based on descriptions I've seen of Blue Earth, of the reservation, that this could be pre-expulsion. This could be before April of '63, really. And if we could get a better look at the vegetation, we could maybe figure that a little more of that out. Yeah, there's so many questions. So why don't we know more? Why don't we know more about this image and its place in the collection? And
well, we can ask some of the staff here. But more specifically is that when Minnesota tried to remove ho-chunks from the state, it also became a non-priority for collecting ho-chunk items. And so you can see within the collections specifically here that there are only a handful of actual ho-chunk things. So the things that are in the case are the bandolier bag, which we know typically took, if it was a single woman making that bag, it would take her an entire winter to make. So that means that she put in all of the time, all of her effort in the evenings or whenever she had free time to put that bag together. And when we look at the amount of man hours, the cost of that, it means that somebody had enough space to do that, to take care of her family. The same with those beaded loomed pieces. Oftentimes that you see in other museum collections is that those items were either traded or sold to a collector or somebody else in order to make money for a family. So we do know that those things, at the time that they were sold, most likely it was so that a family could take care of their entire group, so that they would have enough food and clothing to make it through a winter so that they could start prepping again in the spring.
One thing that just occurs to me looking at these is the stories that I've read in the archive, actually in Minnesota collections, of just after the expulsion of the ho-chunk from Blue Earth, settlers who have been dying to get access to that land. That's what Kathy Coates' wonderful book is partly about. Settlers dying to get access to that land, rushing in and not even bothering to build their own structures, living in these, or the equivalent of these, for years sometimes. While they sort of set up camp and then homesteads in what until recently had been ho-chunk homeland. Let's see. Maybe we want to give folks a chance to ask us some questions.
Yeah.
Yeah. Why don't we move to that? Jacob, how do you want to do this?
We'll have a microphone, and I'll be on one aisle, and then Elizabeth will be on another aisle. So raise your hand, and we'll get a mic to you so the rest of the audience and our online audience can also hear you. So, and then we'll do some questions.
All right, with this slide up here, and I first have to apologize, I'm white, uninformed, stupid. So what is the relationship between Winnebago and ho-chunk? I mean, to me, they're two different names. And Cheras, does that refer to, is that a name of a shelter? What is a Chera? C-H, yeah, the one on the far right.
I have no idea what a cheras is. Ho-chunk is our name for ourselves. Oh, okay, never mind. It is somebody trying to understand ho-chunk. Okay, it says cheetah. Chi is a home. Somebody's just went off of how she said it, so thank you. So now you get another lesson in ho-chunk language. So ho-chunk is our name for ourselves. Winnebago is a Algonquin term, and then translated into French, which is also how we end up with cheras instead of cheetahs, of cheetah. It's trying to understand a language and translating it into a phonetic alphabet that somebody else can understand. But Winnebago is what the US government used in treaty negotiations as well as federal paperwork, so it is a recognized term from the US government. However, it is not our name for ourselves, and it's not the federally recognized term that we use today.
Confusingly, it is what the Nebraska branch of the ho-chunk people uses as their tribal designation.
Yeah.
So.
Hana chani karigiwi majahi wingi hingade naga choga hingade naga chahiki kada chija wanje naga manicho harurus regi hachiaje. So welcome, and I am so proud of my He-chunk over here. I want to show her support, and I love her profoundly in this life and many others. So my name is Majahi Wing, or Swan that dances before takeoff. My colonized name is Jill Green Deer. I am Deer Clan, and I live in Twin Cities. So I am very well aware of the fact that we are rebels right here in this land right here. And this is actually for you, Dr. Kantrowitz, is that correct? Your
Kantrowitz, yeah.
Kantrowitz.
Yeah.
Okay. So when I walked into this room, I mean, all this amazing knowledge that my sister holds, and you're interviewing her. But on that book, her name is not listed as an author. So I think it's very, I guess, audacious that she's not. And the title of the book is Citizens of a Stolen Land. This is also and stolen data. And so, like, if it's not data, and data is our relative, it is living, it is breathing, it is thriving, and each and every one of us, in spirit and heart, through our ancestors. So I hope that you can understand the fact that this work is not something that we can do by ourselves. And as you can see, I did arrive late, but I did that for a reason, because this work is disruptive. And if there is change, there is disruption. It wasn't to disrespect my sister, because I am so proud of her. I love her so much. But you, as a white man in academia, in this institution, also have an obligation. It's not something that is a transactional relationship that you can continue to perpetuate harms on, whether that's your intention or not. It's something that you need to hold very sacred, because our data, our relative is sacred as well. My sister is sacred, my relatives are sacred. And the fact that, you are asking her to interpret, and this is even a prime example, chi is house, right? So the house, and so that's something that, I just find, even profound proof that there is an urgent need to make sure that her voice is elevated, her knowledge is elevated, our collective spirit is elevated, and it's not capitalized on or monetized by non-Indigenous, non-Ho-Chunk people. Kathy Coates did the same thing. So I want you to understand too that if you continue to do this work, you will continue to get resistance. You will continue to get voices, because we're healing, and especially in this political climate here. Mm-hmm. It's even now so more than ever that we need to be elevated. This is where the revolution started. It started all over, but this is where its stronghold. So there's audacity in the fact that you're here speaking to this, but she should be the one speaking. She should be the one writing this book. And all my sisters that contributed to this, all my relatives that contributed to this. Not you, sir. And I know that you have done, not to take away from your prestigious accomplishments by any means, but the fact is that you're stealing our relative. And that is not okay. And if your intent is not to do harm, you need to elevate her and give her that space, because if this data is not elevated by us, it's not for us. Pinagigi Waganamshino.
So let me just say a few things in response, and thank you for the seriousness and the seriousness of your challenge, which I accept as a serious challenge, and has been really at the front of my mind since I started thinking about doing this as work rather than as just something I was curious about, which is that at every step of the way I've tried to do this work in conversation with Ho-Chunk people, and have not thought of this as either the last word or as like a stepping stone, but rather thought of this as Josie suggested at the beginning, there was a demand for a version of this story that people who were curious about it could read, that didn't put all of the demand for explanation on 8,000 Ho-Chunk people, when there are 8 million people living on the Ho-Chunk ancestral footprint. And to me, the success of this as a work would be if in 10 years, a student from the University of Wisconsin or the University of Minnesota, a Ho-Chunk tribal member, rewrote the history and said, what Kantrowitz got wrong was, to me that would be the success of the book, because it would mean that it provided a place to push off for a story that actually represented how Ho-Chunk people think and want to tell this story. It has been both a pleasure and a privilege to be able to do these conversations with Josie over the past year and a half, precisely because I think it's really important that when we're talking about anything Ho-Chunk, whenever possible, that a Ho-Chunk person is present to do that talking. I do think that there's a place for non-tribal members to do some of this work. I think that always has to be done carefully, thoughtfully, and with humility. When I've failed to do that, I will own that. And I'm sure there are places where that's true. But I think I've decided not to just stop doing it.
You mentioned that Ho-Chunk were farmers. Any farmers left in Wisconsin?
Yeah. So a lot of families still have their own gardens that they take care of, but Ho-Chunk actually created an agriculture division within the tribal government as well. So we take care of, oh goodness, I can't tell you a number off the top of my head of farmland, but we also work with a growers co-op of tribes throughout the state of Wisconsin to provide elder food boxes to elders in all of our communities.
So forgive me if I get the terminology wrong, but as I look at the map, when the Ho-Chunks were removed to central Minnesota Long Prairie or to southern Minnesota Blue Earth, wasn't that territory already occupied by other native peoples, Ojibwe, Dakota?
And Ho-Chunks.
And did the peoples mix, or did they retain their separateness?
Let's see here. Yes and no. So having the different reservations set up in Iowa, northern Minnesota, and central Minnesota was a strategic move by the U.S. government in order to use Ho-Chunks as human shields in between other tribes that were forced to compete for resources because of a strain on the environment. So the U.S. government did that specifically and strategically. So in the neutral ground in Iowa, it was neutral because Ho-Chunks were neutral between fighting between other tribes that were at war. It's also how you end up with a lot of stereotypes of Native peoples being warriors and constantly in battle situations, because when you are forced out of your home location and forced to be centralized into a smaller location for limited resources, you are going to fight. That is what the US government has done consistently and strategically for years. So yes, I hope that kind of answers your question, but also when you aren't competing for resources, when you have seasonal movement through locations and you know what you are looking for in terms of food or shelter or anything else, you're not going to be fighting with people. That's no different than me traveling here to the cities for a day.
Thanks very much for being here. I know this group has often heard presentations looking at the history of Dakota people, so I was trying to pay attention to the timelines that you were both explaining to us. And if I understand correctly, it was in April of 1863 when the Ho-Chunks were forced from Blue Earth over to Crow Creek. Is that approximately?
That spring, summer, yeah.
So how can I explain this? So we had what was colloquially referred to as the Indian Uprising in August of 1862 in Minnesota. So how did all these events affect one another? How did I'm thinking about it from a settler's standpoint and from the US government standpoint, how did these things dovetail or inflame one another, or how could they be seen as separate? I think it would just be a terrible time to be a settler in Minnesota. And maybe still is, I don't know.
Yeah, I would say the 1850s were a really terrible time to be a Native person in Minnesota, because at the end of the 1840s, the territory we now call Minnesota had about a 10-to-1 indigenous to non-indigenous population, and a decade later, it had 10-to-1 non-indigenous to indigenous. So a flood of settler humanity invading the territory, pressing people out, assaulting people, and demanding state and federal policies that would expel people from the land. And it's in that context that we get the Dakota Uprising against that settler conquest and what we call the U.S.-Dakota War of 1862. The federal response to that, the crackdown on the Dakota, which results in the internment camp at Fort Snelling and the banishment of the Dakota people from the territory, also includes the federal legislation passed by Congress, signed by President Lincoln, that calls for the expulsion of the Ho-Chunk from Blue Earth to Crow Creek. So it's a really terrible time to be Dakota or Ho-Chunk, the 1850s and early 1860s.
This is a question for Josie. You mentioned that you were initially hesitant to take on this project because of the vast history of the Ho-Chunk people. And I just wanted to give you the space. If we were in a different timeline, in a different world, what other period of history would you be here telling us about? And what resources could we go and find to learn about a different period of Ho-Chunk history?
Oh, goodness. First, I need more Ho-Chunks to go into history to write these books, because it should be. Dr. Kantrowitz did invite me to apply for a PhD at Madison in the history department, to which I thought about and then declined because history is not my passion.
It's a loss.
If I had the opportunity, and I have had some opportunities to talk about Ho-Chunk life, the things that I most specifically like to talk about are the connections between our historic past and our contemporary selves. So one of my favorite things that we did do at our museum while it was still in operation and standing was we did an applique exhibit where we had applique pieces from those that have passed on. So our previous makers, as well as some contemporary makers, to highlight the artists that are in our community and doing really, really incredible work right now, as well as some of the kindergarten through 12th grade students that I teach, so that we can also talk about the future of our artwork. And within our art, we have the references to our history, as well as pieces of our culture, our ties to our land, our ties to our family, and our clans. All of those things are put directly into our art. And so it was really beautiful to see multiple generations into one single location and talk about how that makes us who we are, rather than just a map or just one portion of history. You can't talk about an entire group of people without acknowledging that there's more than a 50-year timeline.
I think Nancy Lurie put this in my head about 35, 40 years ago. I used to teach Indians of the Western Great Lakes at the University of Wisconsin-Madison in the 1980s. Janice, I wonder if Janice Lincoln is one of the people you talk. Janice Bodine, yeah, her daughter. My question, and I had to go to the bathroom, so maybe you answered it, but I think it was Nancy Lurie that put it in my head that whenever the Ho-Chunk got moved, it was always to put them in between two peoples that weren't getting along too well, whether it was the Anishinaabe, Ojibwe up north and the Dakota, or it was the Osage. Yeah. And so it's kind of like, you know, you put them right where there's absolutely no chance of anything good happening for yet another reason. Is that recollection?
Yes.
Yeah, okay. Yeah. That's all I wanted to know.
Yeah, I did mention a little bit, but maybe that was while you were out. So.
It's worth the first relocation outside of the territory of what's now Wisconsin is to a place the government literally calls the neutral ground. I mean, between the Ojibwe and the Dakota. Yeah.
First of all, thank you so much both for coming all the way from Wisconsin to talk with us. This has been great. And I have a question, I think mostly for Josie. So you mentioned when making the map that you talked with elders and community members to kind of gather these different stories to put together. So I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about what that's like talking to elders of your community, getting those stories. How is that maybe different than a Western historical approach of going into the archives or something like that, and how would you say you approach the historical record differently than like a Western historical perspective?
Oh man, that's tough.
I was going to ask you that.
You have to get really comfortable with people telling you no. And I think that, again, I'm really fortunate that I have worked with so many different elders, so that I've spent my entire lifetime trying to build relationships with people so that they know that when I do ask a question, it's not because I solely want and need that information, it's because I'm trying to understand something. But it also comes with the intention that once I do receive that information, it's not just for my own benefit. I am never going into the work that I'm doing solely because I want to hoard everything. It's because I am trying to figure out a way to make information accessible to other tribal members or community members that don't have the same opportunities as me. And so there has also been a lot of work towards understanding what is appropriate to share and what is not appropriate. And there is a lot of humility with being able to say, you don't need that information.
I wanted to thank everyone for being here and for their curiosity and for their trying to understand. And this isn't so much a question as it is a comment. And affirmation as to you saying that, yes, we do need our own people to tell this history. And there's a couple of cases in point I can think of. I don't have, if it would take me half an hour probably to try to remember these particular circumstances, but I remember watching a show where an anthropologist was looking at rock carvings, and he brought a native woman in with him, and well, here's these, and you know, we're trying to figure this part out. And she looked at it and she immediately said, oh, that's because of, you know, and she explained, and he was just like in awe. You know, so that's another you know, reason why, because either maybe in stories or something that we heard or how we were taught, you know, those allowed us to recall and to explain what was meant when those rock carvings were made. That was one point. And then in Mexico, and I can't remember if it was Aztec or Mayan, whatever they call them, hieroglyphics or whatever, they brought a local man in, again, anthropologists or historians, because there were certain areas that, you know, they didn't understand. So the guy comes in there and he's looking and he says, oh yeah, he said, no, that means this was our symbol for this and that, you know, and it just opened up so much for everyone else. So not only with Native people here in North America, but I think throughout the world we need to have those voices. And thanks again for being here and expanding my knowledge.
Hi, Josie and Doctor. Thank you both for being
Steve.
Josie, jumping off of your point about talking to the elders and being able to accept them saying no, I heard you talk about how you work with kids and engage in creating artwork with them. I'm wondering how the kids that you work with see the past and see the present and see the future as it relates to this history, or if it, you know, depending on their interest or how you hear it expressed from them, how you express it to them. And thank you.
Well, truthfully, I don't know sometimes if the kindergartners I work with quite understand the historical references, but I do know that once we get to high school age students, it's much easier to make some of those connections between the things that they learn in their history textbooks at school and then talking about some Ho-Chunk things outside of it and where they can kind of see the overlap. But most times, to be honest, I only have half an hour with the students, so I don't get to do a lot. It's here's the artwork that we are working on, here is a YouTube video if you need to figure it out on your own after we're done, and if you have questions, give me a call. The people that I end up having the more in-depth conversations with have really been the groups of elders that have come in to take classes with me. And that, I think, has been really, really eye-opening to the point that for one class, I had 30 elders come in to learn from me, which is way outside of my comfort zone. But the best part about it was every conversation that we had was all of them going, I can't wait to tell my kids and I can't wait to tell my grandkids. So I do know that if I'm not reaching a historical mark with some of the kids that I'm teaching virtually, those elders that I'm teaching in person are getting the opportunity to go home and share that too.
Yeah, good afternoon. Is it okay? Yeah, so thank you for being here and sharing these stories. You know, I'm a relative of you way back, several hundred years back, some Iowa. So we consider you all our grandpas, Ho-Chunk people. And so I think this is a question about, you know, future. You know, it's about Ho-Chunk guidance and Ho-Chunk leadership. And in the times we're in and going forward. And so I think, understanding this historical context of you all in this place and throughout the Mound region is of course foundational to moving forward. And so I think just my wondering is around, what are some of the core, maybe, I don't know if it's ethics, I don't know if it's governance, I don't know if it's land stewardship practices that you think are most important for non-Ho-Chunk people to know going forward. And then within that, what are opportunities to advocate and follow lead of Ho-Chunk people going forward through the times we're in?
There is a reason I am not in leadership. Truthfully, the things that you can see from the historical record, as well as what I have at least tried to push with programming, is building community. It's the only way that you are going to be able to get through the mental overwhelm is by having people that you can rely on and talk through all of the difficult questions with. Because I can sit by myself and go crazy going, what if, what if, what if? But if I don't have others that I can say, we know how to hunt, we know how to fish, we know how to take care of ourselves based on the location that we're at. We've done this before, we have gone through all of this before. This is not that vastly different than what Ho-Chunks or Menominee saw in the 60s and 70s with the termination era. It's no different than what my grandparents and great-grandparents went through when discussing whether or not we would form a tribal government. It's no different than what my great-great-grandparents were seeing during the genocidal removals. None of it is really that vastly different than the things that we're experiencing now. So having community, being able to find whatever it is that you believe in to get you through it, as well as recognizing that I am still going to be trying to practice my language, I'm still practicing my culture, I'm still trying to teach everything that I can to my kids, and learning from those around me is going to be the most important thing for myself.
Going back to that photograph, can you tell us a little bit about how you identified the people and the stuff in the picture as Ho-Chunk?
The houses and the clothing. Those are the two most identifiable things. Not related to this photo, but the museum was just donated a beautiful photo album of 138 photos of students from the Neelsville boarding school. And one of my favorite things that I have found, even though we haven't been able to identify the pictures yet, is how similar family features carry. And some Ho-Chunk family features are very distinct. And so I am fairly positive that if looking at this photo, we know that there should be at least relatives of Little Priest recognized within here, as well as a few others. There are certain distinguishable family features that you should be able to look for.
Hi. 50 years ago, I got an honors degree in history, and I don't know any of this history. So it is never too late, both from the academic research and the lived oral history and the stories of the elders, to convene us all to learn and to move forward with all of this information, because internationally we are facing a recommendation of the removal of a whole people from a land in the Middle East to wherever. This experience is going on as we live and breathe now. And I am so grateful for the academic approach and your lived learning approach to bring us to mind that this is still going on.
I think that's maybe a good place, a moment of gratitude and a reminder that history is not in the past, it's in the present, and it informs our present and our future. Thank you so much to both of you. I also just want to acknowledge that engagement in these issues can be difficult, and it can be experienced differently by all of us, depending on who we are and our own personal histories and family histories. So I'm really grateful to those of you joining us today to be willing to do that. We know that engaging with difficult topics, engaging with difference, engaging with things that we don't know, that's hard. And that's something that we're definitely in need of these days. So thank you so much for being here. Thank you for allowing us to be able to bring this to you. And please continue to bring your questions and your conversations, and to get to say hello to Josie and Steve up in the rotunda as we finish. So thank you, and check out our events. We got a lot of good stuff coming up.